In 1998, Pokemon Generation 1 released, sparking a global phenomenon. Everywhere you went, you could not escape the craze around Pokemon. From the games themselves, the merchandise, the trading cards, and the anime, Pokemon in only a set of 2 games and a later definitive edition became the fastest growing IP of all time, which hadn't been seen since the debut of Mario. So how did Generation 1 begin Pokemania? Well, obviously watch the video to find out. If you were born between the 80s and the 2000s, you most likely had an initial experience with Pokemon. Whether it was the games or the anime, my first experience, like so many others, was the games. I began playing Pokemon during Gen 4, and I remember going to school with my DS and comparing teams with the other kids when we were huddled together at recess. It got so bad to the point that my school not only would confiscate your DS if you were caught, but they went the extra mile and banned the trading card game as well. That just goes to show you how integrated Pokemon was in the childhood of many kids. Over the years, I would always fall in and out of the series, stopping at White 2, but would occasionally peek my head in to see what I missed during my hiatus. One of the things Pokemon is best known for is its dual release when a new generation debuts. There are many versions of Gen 1 specifically. There's the Game Boy originals, the Gen 3 remakes, and the recent Yellow remakes on the Switch. But for this video, all the gameplay you'll be seeing is from Pokemon Blue Evolved versions. Why Pokemon Blue Evolved versions, some of you might be asking? Why not play the more popular Red or even Yellow? Well, it actually goes back to my own history with the franchise. True story, when Gen 4 was in its prime, I was the only kid in my grade with Pearl. Everyone else had Diamond, and to tell another quick story, when the Gen 2 remakes came out and I went to go buy it, Heart Gold was entirely sold out, so I had to settle for Soul Silver instead. Since then, I've always gravitated towards the lesser versions, if that makes sense. But besides minor differences in story and catchable Pokemon, do version differences really matter at this point? In the case of Gen 1, not really. It honestly comes down to personal taste, and Yellow was glorified marketing for the anime. Call me a contrarian all you want, but Blue's cover contains my favorite Pokemon in the series, and by saying that I just gave away what my starter will be. Before we formally begin, I'll only be covering Gen 1, and later on when I return to Pokemon in the future, it'll be Gen 2 of course. And just to make this clear, this video is meant to encapsulate Gen 1 as a whole. I will not be talking about the original versions released in Japan first as Red and Green, because I want to stick with the international version. It's just that the vast majority of gameplay you'll be seeing is from Blue. Cool? Okay. That's enough rambling now, it's time to begin Pokemon Generation 1. Well, when you boot up the game, you're presented with a battle between a Jigglypuff and a Gengar, alongside the battle theme. Almost like the game is getting you excited for what you're about to experience, with the Pokemon title appearing afterwards, alongside the version's mascot and a roll call of different Pokemon. Pressing the start button and beginning a new game, you're introduced to Professor Oak, a scientist dedicated to the research of Pokemon, animal-like companions with a range of different properties. You then name your character, which of course I named after myself, and let's be honest here, there are 2 types of Pokemon players. Those who spell their name formally, or those who spell it in all caps. After naming yourself, you then name your rival, because Oak literally forgets the name of his grandson, almost like he likes me over his grandson. And I don't blame him, he's a shithead. In fact, you can name him whatever you want. I named him Gary because that's what he's based off of, but if you're feeling creative, you can go with fuckface, shithead, jerk off, jag off, fuck off, that's my favorite, or if you're feeling really petty, should have been a blowjob. Technically they both have canon names, but the lead is named Red and the rival Blue, and it wasn't until Gen 3 when the girl was given the name Leaf. You can name them whatever you want. Once introductions are done, Oak welcomes you to the world of Pokemon, and the beginning of your Pokemon legend. Beginning in your room, you can look around and grab a free potion from the PC and head downstairs to speak with your mother, remarking that today is the day you leave home and embark on your journey. Heading outside, you live in the quiet town of Pallet Town, with friendly faces, with the exception of Gary, and a Pokemon lab owned by Professor Oak. When we try to leave, Oak appears warning us to get out of the grass because of the dangers of wild Pokemon, insisting we visit his lab before leaving. Oak escorts us to the lab where we find Gary and 3 Pokeballs on the table. He then tells us to pick one out of the 3, and from there we can decide our starter Pokemon, the Fire-type Charmander, the Water-type Squirtle, and the Grass-type Bulbasaur. Because I gave away what starter I'm choosing, I chose my favorite Pokemon in the series, the Water-type Squirtle. I've always gravitated to Water types, and I can thank Squirtle for cementing that. However, Gary will always pick the Pokemon you're weak to, and since I picked Squirtle, he chose the Grass-type Bulbasaur. If you're playing Yellow, you'll start with a Pikachu. As you're about to leave, Gary for some reason thinks now's the time to start a Pokemon battle inside Oak's lab, which if we walked a couple more feet could have been taken outside. But here's where you begin your first Pokemon battle, and because it's the first battle, the only move you can do is Tackle. I'll hold off on explaining the battle mechanics. Eventually you manage to defeat Gary, and once you exit Oak's lab, your journey officially begins. The introduction to every Pokemon game is one of the most memorable parts of every playthrough. Every kid, no matter what generation they started with, remembers that experience of meeting the game's professor, being explained what Pokemon are, meeting a rival, and of course choosing your starter. Gen 1 began this trend, and it hasn't changed since. Unlike other JRPGs which spend a good hour or two setting up the story, introducing the world and characters, Pokemon keeps it simple because it knows why you're playing these games at the end of the day. So what is your goal in Pokemon? To be the very best, like no one ever was? To catch 'em all as your destiny? Well, yes and no. You see, Professor Oak at the start will give you the Pokédex, and tell you to travel the region to document the numerous Pokemon you come across. But in actuality, your real goal is to collect the 8 gym badges and become the Pokemon League champion. Those gyms in question are located in the numerous towns and cities around Kanto. Pokemon plots at the end of the day are very basic. Early on in Gen 1, you'll be traveling to the first few towns and battle the local gym leader, up until you reach Mount Moon and discover the world's bigger than just your small town. One of Pokemon's strengths has always been the grandiosity of the regions you explore. Unlike other franchises which are set in fantasy kingdoms or alien planets, Pokemon instead takes on a more grounded approach, having the regions be closely related to our world. Like how dungeons are set in cave systems and corporate buildings, able to capture the imagination a child who first played Pokemon probably experienced. Kanto itself being based on the Kanto region of Japan. In fact, many of the landmarks and cities are real locations you can visit, and I guarantee you Pokemon single-handedly drove up tourism in these areas. Because up until this point, a modern-day JRPG was never done before. The only other example I could think of was the Shin Megami Tensei series, which, ironically enough, has a lot of similar mechanics to Pokemon. By itself, Kanto is an aesthetically pleasing overworld. There are numerous grasslands, caves, seas, and even a bike path you'll take to reach another city. It really does feel like you're part of a larger world, going from your small town of Palatown to the big city of Celadon City. Makes you remember that you're just a country bumpkin entering a big world. And considering this was released on the Game Boy, it's astounding to think they were able to put this much content into an 8-bit cartridge. Exploring Kanto has the grandiosity needed to make you feel like you're embarking on a coming-of-age grand adventure, like one of my other favorite franchises, The Legend of Zelda. And there's your obligatory Zelda reference. Once you begin the game, if you check your inventory, the first item in your inventory is a town map, and by selecting it, you can use it to help give you directions on where to go next. That being said, it only shows you where specific towns and routes are, and if you want to know where you are, you'll have to consult an outside map, because Gen 1 doesn't give you accurate information on where you are. So if you want to catch a specific Pokemon found on Route 25, unless you know where Route 25 is, I have to consult the map, which takes up space in my inventory, which don't worry, I'll get to that, or consult game facts. Even to those of us who have played Gen 1 before, I think having a map on standby makes the adventure much smoother, because Gen 1 doesn't tell you what to do or where to go to. So if you don't have a required HN needed to progress, you could potentially be left stuck on what to do. Because during my playthrough, I forgot to get the Strengthening Gem, and had to backtrack to Fushia City. Thankfully, I had the Gold Teeth in my PC inventory, so I didn't have to go to the Safari Stone again. I say that because your Pokemon will aid you outside of battle. There will be moments when you'll be unable to progress without an HM, so you'll first have to find it, which can be tedious on a first playthrough, then have a certain Pokemon learn the move. Because this is Gen 1, you can't unlearn an HM, so you have to make sure you don't give a shitty move like Cut to one of your core team members. But then again, that's where I like to call the bitch Pokemon comes in. Pretty much a Pokemon solely meant to learn HM moves, that way your other Pokemon don't need to waste a move slot. Except in the case of Flash, which I completely ignored, and used the map to navigate the caves. That's not to say all the HM moves are bad, because I taught my Blastoise Surf, and it's not only great for its intended use, but also a great water-type move. And on the other hand, I taught Strength to Snorlax, and he was easily one-shotting a lot of trainers. Speaking of trainers, I think now's the time I actually discuss the actual mechanics of Pokemon. To begin, there are 2 types of Pokemon battles you'll encounter. The first is wild Pokemon when exploring tall grass or caves, and trainer battles. I'll go over wild Pokemon because that's the simpler of the two, and where the saying gotta catch 'em all comes to the equation. Wild Pokemon are the equivalent of random encounters you face in other JRPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. Once the screen transitions and the battle begins, you'll sound out your currently equipped Pokemon. From there, you can do 4 actions: attack, swap Pokemon, use an item like potions or revives, or run from the battle. If you choose to fight, you'll then select one of 4 moves, each with different effects depending on the Pokemon type. However, there are only 2 outcomes to every wild encounter. You can drain their health to 0, gain XP to level up, or do what the game nudges you to do, get their HP just low enough so you can use a Pokeball to catch them, add them to your team, or to your Pokedex. The Pokedex, speaking of, will give a biology report on the captured Pokemon, adding a great deal of world building. Suffice to say, catching Pokemon will be how you assemble your team. For Gen 1, there are a total of 151 Pokemon for you to collect. To find every single one of them, you'll have to explore all across Kanto, meaning that depending on where you are currently, certain Pokemon will appear in certain areas. This on one hand incentivizes the player to explore new areas, while on the other hand, makes getting certain Pokemon you want a bit of a hassle. In fact, this right here is where the discrepancies between versions take center stage, because depending on what version you have, some Pokemon will be unavailable, and you'll have to trade it with another person or settle for something else. Trading is a big part of the Pokemon ecosystem, and if you talk to certain NPCs, some of them will ask to trade with you. But at the end of the day, it's only relevant to the current generation. But I won't deduct points on that front because it only exists for completionists, and if you're like me and just want to beat the game, then you'll only worry about catching the Pokemon you want and a couple of extras. However, seeing the different breeds and types of Pokemon you encounter does make catching some like the rare legendary Pokemon a worthwhile indulgence. I think one of the few areas Gen 1 still holds up in is the pixel art for all the different Pokemon. Some Pokemon like Snorlax or the Ghost types still look great with the pixel art able to reflect the official artwork. I only wish the color added if played on a Game Boy Color was more than just a blue or red gradient and reflected the color of Gen 2 that came later. But in actuality, battles will be where you and your Pokemon are put to the test. Let me start off by saying that I love the way Pokemon handles these battles. When traveling the overworld, you'll see a plethora of other Pokemon trainers minding their business until you come into view of them, and once you do that, the iconic jingle will play, beginning a trainer battle. Now at this point, I can start delving into the complexities of the battle system. To start, in Gen 1, there are a total of 15 different types of Pokemon that can fall into, and depending on their type will affect what moves they can learn and what Pokemon they are effective and weak against. So for example, if you have a water type like Squirtle, they won't be able to learn fire type moves, however, the moves they do learn like Bubble Beam will deal more damage if used against the fire type. But in a system like this, there will be trade-offs because water types are weak against grass and electric types. That's why at the start of the game you're given a choice between a fire, water, and grass type, because each of them are effective and resistant against the other. And depending on your starter, your rival will pick the Pokemon you are weak against. So if anything, Pokemon is a more complicated game of rock, paper, scissors. That being said, certain Pokemon are able to have dual types like the fire flying type Charizard, allowing him to learn moves like Fly at the cost of now being weak to electric types. How does this all relate to trainer battles? Like I explained earlier, if you're fighting a trainer who uses a water type, your best bet is to use an electric type like Jolteon to deal the most amount of damage. And Gen 1 does a good job of giving you hints as to what types of trainers you'll be fighting against. Like when you're crossing Vermilion Forest and all the trainers there will be using bug types, whereas if you're on Sea Route 23, you'll be primarily fighting against water types. Routes, from what I've noticed, tend to have a variety of what you'll see. At the start of the game, you'll face the usual Rattata and Caterpie, but the further you get, trainers will definitely start mixing up their teams, forcing you to be on your toes. Depending on the trainer, they'll have a certain amount of Pokemon on their team, and your job is to feint every single one of them, resulting in earning money and XP. And if by some chance all your Pokemon are fainted, you'll have to cough up money, and on top of that, you'll faint like a drama queen, respawning at a nearby Poke Center, because you can't run from trainer battles. It's winner takes all. But to be honest, it's not as bad as it seems because remember, you can see every trainer you encounter, and in some cases you can entirely skip a battle if you want to. So if anything, Pokemon gives you a risk versus reward system, letting you decide if you want to battle every trainer in your path, or to only fight mandatory battles. However, in my opinion, you should actively try to get into as many fights as you can because you don't want to risk being underleveled, especially during gym battles, because the only way for your Pokemon to level up and learn new moves is to fight in trainer battles, which give the most XP. But to balance it out, XP will only be rewarded to Pokemon who participated in the battle. Now, a fan favorite tactic I'm sure everyone who's played Pokemon has done is to put the Pokemon you intend to grind in the top spot, and once the battle begins, you switch to a more appropriate Pokemon and win the battle, allowing the former to reap half the XP, which is what I did to help grind my Abra. For what it's worth, there's a lot of complexities buried deep within the battle mechanics, however, not all of it is perfect. I'm sure all of you who have played Gen 1 already know this, but Gen 1's battle mechanics have not aged well over the years. On paper, every core mechanic is needed to make Gen 1 a great JRPG because of all the different Pokemon and trainers you'll encounter. You have to actively consider what Pokemon will be on your team and strategize effectively during battle to counter another trainer's Pokemon. Remember what I said earlier about TMs and HMs? Well, some of them aren't too bad. It's that carrying them is a pain in the ass because of Gen 1's limited item capacity. Some trainers will have moves that will stun or poison your Pokemon, and the only way to remove it are Poke Centers and items. There were moments I had to discard a TM because I would rather have a healing item on standby, and it's not like I was going to use most of the TMs I found on the wild. But to get back to what I was saying, to give an honest confession, the only time I had to think ahead and strategize was during the last two bosses because before, all I did was use Pokemon effective against other Pokemon. and the hallmark of any good JRPG will require you to exploit the enemy's weakness to achieve victory. And for what it's worth, that system does exist in Gen 1, except it doesn't go beyond the scope of what's presented, because Pokemon battles in Gen 1 are one-on-one fights. A lot of the battles boil down to being wars of attrition where both you take turns taking potshots at each other until one of you goes down. To go more in depth, in Gen 1 moves are categorized as either physical or special moves. Normal type moves, for example, fall under the physical category and as a result are based on the attack stat, and the damage you receive is calculated against your defense. Pretty self-explanatory. Whereas elemental moves fall under the special umbrella. But what makes this so baffling is that before the special split in Gen 2, your special attack and special defense are concentrated under the special stat, meaning Pokemon with a high special stat will deal loads of damage against a Pokemon with a low special stat. To put it in layman's terms, it's all based on one stat rather than two like later generations would do. To give an example, and I'm pretty sure all of you know what I'm about to say, but the reason for Psychic types being OP in Gen 1 is for one, bugs and glitches, the other being their higher rates of growth in the special stat compared to the other types. And because they deal base damage against every other type besides their own, they can effectively solo every battle if their special stat is high enough. Psychic types are essentially the poster child for Gen 1's poor balancing. However, I won't lie and say I had a fun time one-shotting gym trainers with Psychic, but man, they should have at least added another weakness to Psychics like what Gen 2 did later on by making them weak against Ghost types. The poor balancing is essentially the main reason why Gen 1 is hard to go back to, and makes the remakes the more tantalizing option. However, battle mechanics aside, the real fun of Pokemon and the reason why I play the games is the act of forming my team. Now I have a serious question. When you guys start a playthrough, of whatever generation you do you guys premeditate what Pokemon you'll catch? Or do you experiment as you go, constantly adapting your team to fit whatever scenario you're in? To use myself as an example, in every Pokemon game I play, I always have an Eevee on my team. Because not only is Eevee my second favorite Pokemon, but unlike other Pokemon, Eevee in Gen 1 can evolve into 3 evolutions depending on the player's choice. Usually if I don't choose a water type as my starter, I would evolve Eevee to Vaporeon. That way I have a Pokemon who not only knows Surf, but because Vaporeon's defense is an absolute unit. However, because I chose Squirtle, for my evolution, I went with the Thunder-type Jolteon. I'll skip a quick mention to the Fire-type Flareon, however, I think it's the weakest of the three, not due to its stat growth, but by the time you get Eevee, you have obtained the Thunderbolt TM from a previous gym, and can start teaching Jolteon a solid Thunder-type move. Alongside the fact that in order to get to the Fire-type gym, you have to cross the sea routes full of trainers with water types. So you can see where I'm going with this. But to put a pause on the Eevee glazing, I'll also do a quick roll call as to the other members of my team. Of course, obviously there's Squirtle, who was with me throughout the whole journey, and he was extremely useful during the first gym, since rock types are weak against water types. Squirtle was easily my strongest Pokemon to the point where I had to shelve him for a bit, so that way my other Pokemon could gain levels. But in the grand scheme of things, it makes sense given your starter's been with you since the beginning. Also in the anime, Squirtle is in charge of a gang of other Squirtles, and they all wear the most stereotypical rocker shades ever. Squirtle takes no prisoners. Early on, I caught a Pidgey, and for a while leveled it up and taught it Fly. However, by Cinnabar Island, I relegated it to bitch Pokemon status. But looking back, I should have committed more effort into Pidgey, that way I could have had a solid flying type, but it is what it is. At the very least, Pidgey served well throughout the early game, allowing me to get the third member of my team, Diglett, who thanks to his high speed and being a ground type can learn moves like Dig and Earthquake, allowing him to get high amounts of damage in quick succession. And even if he does take damage, he can use Dig again, allowing him to avoid upcoming damage, so long as he doesn't use it against flying types. Next came Eevee, which has just been a good minute of praising, but it's great that the devs put it in Celadon City, the same place you can buy an Element Stone, like the game nudging you to evolve the new Eevee you just got. Next, I backtracked to Route 25 and grabbed myself an Abra, that way I'll have a Psychic-type Pokemon, because in Gen 1, it feels like you're putting yourself at a disadvantage by not having a Psychic, for the reasons I explained earlier. Then, of course, I caught the Snorlax in Route 12 like a lot of other players do, because Snorlax is a complete tank thanks to its high HP and defense. However, the catch is that there are only 2 in the entire game, so to catch or not to catch is your choice. But if you have a free slot available, Snorlax is a solid choice. And finally, we have Ponyta, which, if I could be honest, I should have kept Pidgey on my team. But in my headspace, I wanted a fire type, and looking back, I should have gotten a Vulpix instead. Plus, I didn't give Ponyta the best moves at all, and it was definitely a last-minute decision. But to encapsulate all of what I've just said, assembling your team is the highlight of every Pokemon playthrough, which as a result creates a lot of replay value because even depending on what starter you pick will affect how the rest of your team will turn out. You don't want to have a full team of Rattatas, but instead want to cover your bases with the major types. And I didn't even go over the daycare system, which adds another layer of raising Pokemon, which to be honest, I never bothered to learn. Pokemon on the surface seems like a simple JRPG, but if you take the time and learn a lot of the nuances, you can easily spend hundreds of hours training and trading your Pokemon. All of it culminates against your repeated battles against your rival Gary. This guy at certain points will appear challenging you to a trainer battle, as a way to check your skills as a trainer. Gary throughout the game is not that difficult up until his last two encounters, and the game gives you no warning when he comes because you'll just be walking when all of a sudden you'll hear. Once that theme plays, I automatically say to myself, this fucking guy again. And he's always a dick to you, even when you win. Rival battles, though, are a staple of every Pokemon game because at their core, they're meant to give you a consistent antagonist you have to defeat to keep progressing and improve your Pokemon team. Gary's team will even have minor differences depending on your respective starters, so on a repeated playthrough, Gary's endgame team will have slight variations. That's why I wanted to get a fire type because the Venusaur with Solar Beam is scary. Thankfully, I had a Starlock so I was able to tank the damage. To summarize Gary in standard JRPG terms, he's like the mini-boss you face before fighting the real boss. Because gyms are where the real challenges lie. There are a total of 8 gyms across Kanto, and your real goal is to defeat the gym master at the end and obtain their badge. However, gyms aren't just places where you'll be fighting the usual trainers you see in the overworld. Instead, each gym has a unique theme to them, meaning every gym will have an affinity towards a certain Pokemon type. So like everything you've learned up until this point, gyms are meant to push you and your Pokemon to your limits. However, getting to the gym is an entirely different story. Early in the game, most gyms only require you to walk in, beat the gym leader, and get the badge. But by a certain point, certain gyms can only be accessed unless you reach a certain point in the story, or solve a local town problem, usually in the form of a local Team Rocket infestation. Once that's done, you'll then be eligible to face the town's gym leader. If a gym isn't available, take the time to speak to the locals and from your conversations, get an idea as to what to do. In Saffron City, heading to the gym, you'll notice a Team Rocket goon blocking the entrance. By talking to the locals, you find out that Team Rocket is taking the Sylph Co building hostage, the tallest building in the city, and you'll have to defeat Team Rocket's boss at the end to open the gym. It can come off as the game forcing you to take a detour, but encounters like those are rare, and it does serve in creating world building. Gyms are Pokemon's equivalent of dungeons, and like other dungeons in JRPGs, your goal is to battle your way through the enemies to face the boss at the end. Early on, gyms will have very basic designs to them, like the first gym is one trainer battle and then it's on to Brock. And the funny thing is, there's nothing stopping you from leaving the gym at any point to heal at a Poke Center, and return to what you were doing, like when I took too much damage during a battle at Celadon Gym. So I left, and I went to the Poke Center. By the time I got back, I ignored the other trainers and went straight for Erica, because after all, Poke Centers are free, potions aren't. Later gyms will introduce light puzzle solving. I use the word light specifically because some puzzles like in Vermilion City will have you pull switches out of bins, and if you mess up, the puzzle will reset, forcing you to guess the correct switch all over again. And Saffron City Falls is up by having you solve a teleporter puzzle to eventually make your way to the gym leader. To play devil's advocate, I would argue that Saffron City is the exception to the rule because if you don't want to backtrack, definitely come prepared with potions. Then there's Cinnabar Gym, which is just a gauntlet of fire-type trainers, which my Blastoise made quick work of. And again, once I got to the gym leader, I went to the Poke Center not to heal, but to refill Blastoise's PB. Though I do love how Viridian City's gym is the first gym you'll come across, when in actuality, it's the last gym you'll face, completing your trip around Kanto. In fact, during the course of the game, you're doing a complete lap around Kanto, ending it with the first town you visited. But at the end of the day, every gym culminates in a battle against its leader. Because every gym favors a specific type, you'll know ahead of time what Pokemon the gym leader will favor. This is where structuring your team comes most prominently because you don't want to fight a gym leader like Lieutenant Surge with a water or flying type. So instead, you catch a Diglett nearby, teach a Dig to make quick work of the Lieutenant. As long as you follow the weakness order, you'll be fine against gym leaders. Don't let their levels intimidate you because look at it this way, it's letting you know how much XP you're going to get. Even when I fought against gym leaders of a similar type, Misty's water types, my Squirtle was not only able to tank any water attacks, but Tackle was more than able to deal enough damage. The same thing goes for Sabrina because my Doug trio was able to easily avoid her psychic attacks. I know they might come off as me being dismissive of the gym leaders since they're meant to be the strongest opponents, but because their strategies are so predictable, I know how to handle each and every one of them. And anyone who has played a JRPG before knows that the hallmark to achieve victory requires you to come up with a strategy to counter your opponent. Gen 1's gyms at their core are very basic as a result of Gen 1's mechanics and poor balancing. However, this was remedied in later generations with not only improved level design, making gyms the dungeons they're meant to be, but also once more types started being introduced and dual types became more common. However, besides gyms, you'll repeatedly battle the notorious Team Rocket. Basically, the Pokemon universe is equivalent of the Mafia, because when Gen 1 was brought overseas, Team Rocket's leader was given the name Giovanni, the most stereotypical mob boss name ever. But it does manage to get the point across. They're an evil organization constantly interrupting your progress. You'll first encounter Team Rocket during your trek through Mount Moon, and they'll try to stop you by initiating trainer battles. What's funny about these battles is that I guess due to internal policies, Team Rocket members will only use the same pool of Pokemon, favoring normal and poison types, making their battles piss easy. And when you battle them, they don't even try to attack you afterwards. I guess they have the same code of honor as trainers because it would be really bad if they were the actual Mafia. Team Rocket is never meant to be taken seriously because their grunts are total goofballs. And for some reason, the authorities in the Pokemon universe never seem to go after them. And in the anime, they have a straight up base of operations. How the hell does that happen? Are there courts in the Pokemon world? There's a police force, but they only come in after the fact, like when this family has their home broken into. Though I guess that's where you come into the picture, because you'll be actively dismantling Team Rocket's organization by infiltrating their bases and thwarting their schemes. You, a lone 10-year-old. In context, Team Rocket does serve to add variety to the overall story, breaking the pace in between gyms. And also take on the role of dungeons, because like other JRPGs, you'll have to battle the goons, ending with a fight against the boss. You're first introduced to Giovanni at the Rocket HQ, and then again at the Silphico building after Team Rocket has taken the entire building hostage. Which again, where are the police in all this? But it does end up being a pretty fun dungeon in the end. There are numerous teleporters scattered around, and you have to figure out which one leads to your destination. There's no random accounts in here, so you only have to worry about the Rocket goons. But then when you're near the end, Gary comes out of nowhere wanting to battle you, when there's a serious situation going on. But for going out of your way to help the president, you're rewarded with the Master Ball, specially made for you-know-who. There's also another base you'll infiltrate when you enter a Team Rocket controlled casino and discover a lever hidden behind a poster unlocking a secret entrance. Turns out if you speak to the civilians at Celadon City's restaurant, they'll tell you how rigged the games are, and one disgruntled guy will even give his coin case to you, which is great because you can earn tokens to buy some of the strongest TMs. However, I never sink too much time into it because I want to get a move on, to be honest. Giovanni, to be frank, is not a very intimidating boss fight. He does use a couple of the standard Team Rocket Pokemon, but when you fight him at the final gym, he oddly specializes in ground types. Oh yeah, he's the secret 8th gym leader you were told earlier at Viridian City. And I guess the Pokemon Link doesn't do background checks, because to my knowledge, it's never explained how he got that position. And by the time you reach the 8th gym, you'll probably have a pretty robust water type making quick work of his team, with Giovanni afterwards rewarding you with the final badge. And if you talk to him again, he'll announce the disbandment of Team Rocket, leaving Kanto for parts unknown. A very one-dimensional villain. He wants to use Pokemon for profit and evil, and that's about it. But with all 8 gym badges in hand, the next stop is to cross Victory Road and face the Elite Four. On your way to the Pokemon League, you'll run into Gary who will challenge you to a Pokemon battle. And here's where the game will check you to see if you're ready to face the Elite Four, the hardest trainers in the entire region. Definitely go into Victory Road at least in your mid-40s in my opinion, however, that's more related to Pokemon who will be on the reserve, because your main damage dealers should be in the late 40s to early 50s. In my case being Blastoise, Snorlax, and Alakazam. Victory Road is a pretty easy final dungeon, I guess you could call it. It has boulder pushing puzzles without the bullshit, and the trainers here are a great avenue to give your Pokemon the last jump of XP before the Elite Four. Once you find your way out, the game gives you one last Poké Center in the shop, and once you cross the point of no return, you'll have to battle the Elite Four and the final boss in a gauntlet to become the Pokemon champion. For being considered the hardest trainers in the game, the Elite Four suffer under the poor balancing of Gen 1. To be fair, they have a lot of unique Pokemons on their team, like Lorelei who uses ice types, which is cool until you learn most of them are also dual water types, and after a couple of zaps from Jolteon, Lorelei was quickly melted away. Then there's Bruno with fighting types, and Kadabra single-handedly steamrolled him. Agatha was next and she uses ghost types, but every type besides normal makes quick work of her. But Lance is where the Elite Four take a sudden difficulty spike, because not only does he use the rare dragon types, but every single one of them has Hyper Beam, I shit you not. And if you don't have a Pokemon with high defense like I did with Snorlax, you could probably get away with stunning them and link damage when Hyper Beam needs to recharge. This was one of the battles I mentioned I had to strategize because half of his team are flying types. I used Jolteon to deal damage, and if he got too low, I swapped to Snorlax to heal. From there, it was a battle of attrition, and because I had a Snorlax and more healing potions, I managed to defeat Lance. After defeating him, Lance congratulates us on defeating the Elite Four, and under normal circumstances, we'd become the champion. Except lo and behold, Gary managed to defeat the Elite Four, and is now the current champion. So with everything now going full circle, we enter the room, and Gary wastes no time gloating and challenging us to the final battle. Like I said a while back, his team will differ depending on your starter. His Alakazam should be taken out as quickly as possible, while his other three can be taken out with relative ease. However, because I chose Squirtle, Gary will have a Gyarados with Hyper Beam, and combined with Venusaur's Solar Beam, you need to take these two out as quickly as possible. Venusaur will spend a turn charging Solar Beam, and when he does, either use an attack where you can't be harmed mid-animation, or have a tank ready to suck up the damage. And if you can do that, you'll have put an end to Gary's short reign. Professor Oak will then appear, explaining to the defeated Gary that the reason why he lost was because, unlike our protagonist, he never treated his Pokemon with trust and love. The power of friendship, essentially. Afterwards, Professor Oak takes him to the next room, where you and your Pokemon are entered into the Pokemon Hall of Fame, officially becoming the Pokemon League champion.
But wait! There's more!
Yeah, see, here's the part where I end the video. However, we're playing Pokemon, and what would Pokemon be without its post-game content? Well, to start, Gen 1's post-game content is pretty bare bones. Usually, if I go back to Gen 1, the first thing I do is collect the 3 legendary flying types, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres. They're located in specific dungeons within the game, and you could have attempted to catch them during your first visit, however, you were most likely going to be underleveled, which is why waiting until the post-game is the best choice. You're incentivized to capture them for the sake of Pokédex completion, and if you don't, they're gone for the rest of the game. But if you've reached this point, who cares, to be honest? If you want to catch them, be my guest. I caught Articuno and Moltres, but quickly lost patience with Zapdos, so I beat it and moved on. Legendaries have different catch rates than other Pokemon because you have to stun them and use Ultra Balls, because lower tier Pokeballs have a lower catch rate. But the real treat of the post game is exploring Cerulean Cave, only accessible to the Pokemon League champion, aka us. Cerulean Cave has the highest level Pokemon in the game, and I imagine this was used as a grinding spot for competitive battling back in the day. When you reach the end, you'll discover the ultimate legendary Pokemon in the game, Mewtwo, referenced earlier at the Pokemon Mansion as a genetic experiment of the original Mew. You could say Mewtwo is the super boss of Gen 1, that is until he meets the Master Ball and is promptly caught. To conclude, Pokemon Generation 1 was a massive success, beginning a global phenomenon and sparking an iconic series with a trio of games. Though Gen 1 has not aged well at all, and future generations would go on to refine the series, the best word I could use to describe Gen 1 is nostalgia. And given Pokemon's obsession with nostalgia and calling back to previous games, Gen 1 is the embodiment of that example. However, nostalgia won't save Gen 1's poor balancing and mechanics, something later generations refined over time, and makes Fire Red and Leaf Green the better versions, and the versions you should play if you want to revisit Gen 1. But Gen 1 is a fun game to break, and to some of you, that might be a good reason to replay the game that started it all. In the future, when I return to Pokemon, it'll be Generation 2 with Crystal version, because that's when version differences start to make a difference. Still, it was a breath of fresh air getting to do my first JRPG for the channel, and I look forward to doing more for the channel in the future. But that's all I have to say, and I'll leave you guys like I always do, by saying thank you for watching, and take care.